Willkommen zu einer weiteren Sitzung von ICIC.
Welcome to another session of ICIC, the International Crimes Investigative Committee. We are today talking to two German scientists who will talk about a topic issue which we have already addressed in an earlier session at length. And we're going to look at the other side of the coin. In the previous session, we addressed the question whether in the so-called vaccines, we know they're not, whether in these so-called vaccines there are possibilities to create self-assembling structures. First of all, in the so-called vaccines only, because there are some images that seem to suggest this. And if you play respective videos from the microscope with high speed, it looks as if structures would self-assemble. You could even think that these things look so strange that they were some kind of microprocessors. On the other hand, there is the possibility that this is something completely different, and that is what we want to look into today to find out what is the virus which we want to fight with the so-called vaccines. Is that in itself a bioweapon, or is it the combination of the virus, which by now is a gain-of-function product, as we all know, in combination with the vaccines? So one creates a so-called panic that the shot, which is responsible for those who panic, can complete the job. And the third point that we're going to address is whether it is possible that whatever is in the vaccines, some people think it's just impurities, there are things that don't belong there. Can it be that what we find can be assembled or correlate with external powers, 5G or else? Can it be triggered from the outside? Of course, that's a bit speculative, whether it's possible to direct humans with that. And then finally, in order to avoid unnecessary panic, just as Judy Mikovits says, if you have an intact immune system, no virus, nothing can do anything to you. Your immune system has to be top, and how to keep it that, healthy diet, and some movements and exercise. These are the points. So let us start. We have two German scientists with us today. One is Klaus Retzlaff and the other is Holger Reißner. We have met before. The audience should have opportunity to understand who you are. Klaus, do you want to give it a start?
Yes, with pleasure. First of all, good evening to all listeners who are interested in this topic. Well, my name is Dr. Klaus Retzlaff. I did my doctorate in the field of theoretical physics. There I dealt specifically with magnetic order phenomena in high-temperature superconductivity as a theoretical physicist, which means that I did the calculations. I'm less of an experimenter. I became aware of the corona vaccines, the topic we're talking about the pandemic, corona vaccines. I became aware of that at an early stage through the video by Dr. Wodark, who said that the figures do not show that this is a pandemic. They don't point to that. And then I dealt with it myself and was only able to find that this is true. Against the background that I also run a video channel, physicians contacted me and they said that they find the vaccines a bit strange, weird phenomena, the side effects that they see, and they asked me, since I also run a dark field microscope as a hobby, they asked me could they look at the vaccines through my dark field microscope, and I did that, and I made films about that. And I also belong to a working group, Vaccines Reconnaissance, which presents a network of scientists worldwide who then analyze these vaccines. because it's a difference whether you just observe some sort of a phenomenon that does one thing or another, and then you actually have to ask yourself, what is it? And we did that, and we used different methods dealing both with impurities as well as with other properties systematically related to this vaccine. Let me say straight off that as a theoretical physicist who's more involved in gravitational research, I'm not an expert in virology, but of course I can say a few things about the physical aspects.
And that's going to be the crucial point if we try to find out what is found in these so-called vials. Holger, would you just introduce yourself as well?
Yes, good evening, everybody.
Holger Reißner, European Industrial Engineer, seit sehr vielen Jahren im Bereich Forschung.
Holger Reißner, European Industrial Engineer, for many years active in the field of research and development. I've also trained students in the field of aerospace mechanical engineering, because just doing the project was a bit boring. You need to pass on what you know as well at some stage. And I'm also part of the expert council that has dealt with the vaccine analysis. But I did have the advantage that for more than a decade I have been in an international body of researchers who have been dealing with exceptional situation of people and of materials as well. So that we have a lot of information already beforehand, and it was then possible to me to keep away these people around me away from this coronavirus panic, to take them out of this, because we could find appropriate defense measures. And with material science, I can only confirm that even though many things were rumored that put more fear into people than helps them, my motto was always courageous people live longer, and that's why I got involved in this.
The interesting point is that I've heard from a couple of scientists that you are possibly the person who made sure that there is a discussion on graphene oxide as content of the vials appeared. Is that right? How did that come about?
Yes, that's true, because in February 2020 we made the first analysis, and then shortly afterwards we also made the first electron scanning microscope and spectral analyses. And at the time I pointed out that it was a carbon compound, but I did not want to claim that it's a graphene or graphene oxide, but I said it's some sort of carbon. And the basic assumption was, and that was more important to me, because in a sterile vaccine, particles of this size should not have been present because they're mechanically dangerous in and of themselves. I gave this information to Andreas Kalker in Spain, and they took my assumption because I had a lot of experience in carbon materials, which are quite commonplace in space travel in aerospace, and they carbon into graphene oxide, and this is not really possible, because with the photographs which were shown in the context of graphene oxide, that this would actually be graphene oxide, because I can't see a graphene oxide in the microscope, light microscope, the photos that were taken. So it couldn't be that. You need a dark field of photography to determine that. But it just became a runaway story, and I couldn't stop it anymore.
Has it never been tested whether it's really graphene oxide? Was that simply assumed?
Well, we did test it and performed corresponding experiments. And in the program crime scene vaccine that we made recently, I pointed this out, and we can also provide information for you so you can see it. To make it easier for the audience, I can say it's oxide, of course. Oxygen is involved. So if you take the oxygen away, that's called reduction. And then what remains is just carbon, and that is black. So you would see that it's a precipitation that you can see. It's a relatively simple experiment. It's high school physics. that you can easily do to prove this. And we did it, of course, but it had become runaway already by then, so that many people already had started circulating graphene oxide defense mechanisms, and they wanted to present this as unique selling proposition, as it were, so I couldn't stop it anymore.
So can, or do we have to fear that there was never a scientifically proven finding that what they saw really was graphene oxide?
Well, if it has been seen and it wasn't an electron scanning microscope, then it wasn't graphene. You can't see it really.
Just a moment. I want to make a comment here. The electron microscopy, you can't really see what you see. You see black and white images, and it can't be done in any electromagnetoscopic. So it has to be framework spectrography, and that is what we have done in our group. And certain peaks have to be found if we had graphene oxide, but these peaks were not seen in our samples. But we have to say there was impurities that we did see of metallic kind, and for us, it seems as if when the campaign was started, the vaccine campaign, a number of manufacturers produced the vaccines by whatever means they had, and first, as it was not filtered properly, the containers were not suitable, and graphene is around everywhere. If you have a coal in your cellar, you have a share of graphene. If you use a coal filter, you have a metallic vessel, it can have graphene particles. So you could find these particles at any length. But the question that we have here is there is systematics to this with an intent. And at least in the samples that we've had so far, I can't give you a precise figure because it changes every day, but it's a high figure of samples. We have not found these things. We found other things, though.
So it's still possible that what Professor Reiner Bergholz explained to us in a hearing is correct. That basically because these are impurities resulting from the production process.
Well, I would assume that because in the impurities and the frequency, we do see differences. If that was intent, why should they put in more or less at times? Culminati, for example, we only found a single sample, a sample that I experimented with myself. I only found it once, and the others were all clear. Janssen and Culminati were so full of impurities that we were just freaked out. We looked at Culminati with so much dirt in it, we wondered whether our laboratory was contaminated. We looked at the slides, what do we have on them, and did a cross-check first, finding that it is always with Culminati and Janssen something as well, but only once. So there are differences, and that's why it doesn't really point out to any systematic approach.
Well, so at this point, if you don't contradict me, we have to state right now that we simply don't know whether, or maybe by way of an accidental impurity or deliberately, any graphene oxide has been added. It's possible that we find it there, but it might also be coincidental because it was intentional. That's my understanding of what you said, Klaus. Then it would not have been found sporadically only or occasionally, but then it would have always been detectable in either more or less large concentrations.
You, of course, would have to allow that thought, as we know that there is no decent quality control at all. So that means for an experimental game, malicious interests could put things in simply and see what happens. So you'd have it in some samples and you wouldn't in others. You can't exclude that. But if you see an impurity, those that we found, I wouldn't see anything functional in them. It was just different things that don't belong there, but not that we could deduct this is a formation of some kind.
Okay, because that is the next question I was going to ask you, because in fact, in the last interview, something was visible under the microscope. It was filmed by Dr. David Nixon, and I've seen corresponding images from others as well already, and amazingly, I've even seen corresponding images in the blood of so-called vaccinated patients. It looked like as if, very slowly, in time-lapse, you could see then what really happened, as if very slowly, structures were coming together, self-assembling structures. Where we, however, couldn't find an explanation, that, well, how can I put it? The solution or the research result was what I just said, but we couldn't find an explanation of how come, and we couldn't find any indications that it was any kind of microprocessors. What would you say on that?
Well, there are self-assembling structures. They do exist, but what we have seen is, for example, that if the body was excited, it created new combinations of materials. What they do is something that we can't be clear about yet, but we also noted that, in principle, they played learning by doing. That means during the production processes, the vaccine, which started with the initial setup, it changed over time. Johnson & Johnson was taken off the market quite quickly. It was unsuspicious in the normal ways, not saying that there was no toxins in it, but that led to changes in the blood of people. That would indicate to me to see whether the spike protein is the cause, and the information is issued by that. And as far as the self-assembling structures are concerned, science is gone as far as saying a federal president said, parts of my statement would only concern you. But the good thing is that the mechanisms that we looked into show that these things are reversible, and we are quite advanced in that. And oxidation is always seen as stress, but stress really starts only if it is above the normal level of the oxygen. Light oxidative stress can disintegrate these combinations. Chlor dioxide, for example.
Okay, it wasn't a former federal president. I think it was a Minister of Interior who said that. But it was still disturbing to hear that from a politician. By now, it's no longer disturbing because one hears only nonsense from our politicians. Now, what do you say on this, Klaus, self-assembling structures? And we're only talking about what we saw in the last interview, namely that these structures could be seen in the under the microscope coming from the vaccines, not the so-called vaccines, but not what happens in the body. That's a different story. We'll speak about that at some other time. But could we say that these things self-assemble under the microscope? They might self-assemble in the blood as well. That's likely if they do it under the microscope. Do they have a purpose? Is there systematic behind it?
Well, what I have observed and filmed in a couple of different settings is self-organization in the vaccine. But I see these processes everywhere in nature. I can take juices of fruits, water from the lakes, and I experimented with this as well. That means I see crystallization formings, and they do differentiate from something that happen in a glass plate on a slide. It's other than in the body. If I take the outside world away, putting it on the slide, for example, there is vaporization, for example, and the concentration increases, and that will form structures according to certain rules. And it's different salts, and that's why you see different structures. Also, if the key word of circuits is said, it's a difference whether I have a crystallization in a slide under the microscope or if I have the three-dimensionality of this substance. I did experiments with that. I took saline solution, for example, and filmed it with a speed camera. Great phenomena, beautiful crystals forming.
Under the microphone.
I did that in the microscope, in speed videos, and where I have the slides, there are structures that resemble printed circuits. But that happens because the crystal's concentration increases because the water evaporates. But there's other things, acetate, different types of salts. They are in the vaccines, and you see them when they dry out.
Mit denen man das Ganze sozusagen ausschließen kann, dass es sich dabei nicht Artefakte handelt. Auch solche Versuche haben wir gemacht.
We can't use that to rule out that they're artifacts. We tried to rule it out. So what we did was we did this in kind of a mini aquarium where you don't have these processes, and then we just looked at which crystallization appear, which is what also can happen in the body. So if I have a crystallization process, I add a solution. If it's a crystal, it has to dissolve again. And if I increase the temperature in solution, then I can actually simulate the process of its enzyme dissolution in the body. So you can basically simulate processes in the body. But unfortunately, we found that many of the things that are in the vaccines, and we realized that those were cortisol crystals that cannot be dissolved or destroyed with enzymes by the body. And cortisol sounds harmless, but it isn't. Most people know cortisol, but cortisol crystals are a substance that have similar properties as the cortisone.
Also diesen Schwarz-Weiß-Displays, die es früher gab. Und da wurden die innerhalb des Displays mitgenutzt.
And most people know it from the black and white displays that the readers had in the past, because they need a very low amount of energy in order to change their state between black and transparent. And what I'm saying is the smallest common denominator is that this should not be in the vaccine based on the production requirements. They're just too large. And so this is being injected into the human body, and this can then create thrombosis, and mechanically, just because of its crystallization form, it can be dangerous and lead to injuries. And those were the first things that we were able to observe. And we carried these experiments out with all the various products, and we found that, okay, something's in Astra as well. It looks contaminated, and with normal cationic carcinogenic vaccines, it always looked like an aerial photograph in 2045 when you were done with this.
Well, to add to that, it was very frightening to see the series in which we brought vaccine material into our own blood. Blood normally is stable for 10, 14 days on the slide, compared to sick people where this decay is much faster of the blood. It decayed within 3 hours. The red blood cells dissolved completely to thin air, in inverted commas. So they built kind of ghost cells. They lost their hemoglobin and they simply disappeared. And of course, there's a higher concentration if you run spreading it throughout the whole body, but you could see it really. And that was very frightening. If it's of interest what these crystallization phenomena is concerned and self-organization processes, I have a couple of nice videos which I can share if you want to.
damit wir den Unterschied sehen, oder vielleicht gibt es ja gar keinen.
Maybe so we can see the difference, but maybe there isn't any.
Ja.
So, dann
Can you
schauen
see
wir
it?
uns einfach erstmal den Comirnaty vielleicht an.
So, first of all, let us look at the Comirnaty.
Von Interesse ist, wir tun es aus.
So, for the audience, it might be of interest that I'm not going to show the whole video, but here in the Comirnaty, immediately see, and it reoccurs regularly, very different objects, these nanolipid particles, and here these flashing things, as I call them. They are the so-called cholesterol crystals. We have been able to prove this, that it is cholesterol, which has dimensions that Reiner talked about.
Drin sein sollten.
They shouldn't be present in blood.
Kristallisation,
And it's interesting here to see these crystallization. This is Comirnaty, and
schlagartig das passiert, das ist natürlich
you see how quickly it happens. Of course, that is a kind of self-organization, self-assembly, and you can dissolve it. That's the experiment Holger just mentioned.
dann in Lösung wieder zerfällt. Ja, aber
In
sehr-
solution, it would fall apart again, but self-organization, self-assembly
Hier haben wir zum Beispiel
is a natural process. So you have to look at it closely to see what you're looking at. We have this kind of crystallizations in the blood,
das Experiment
where
Impfstoff plus Blut,
this was the experiment,
so wie es
the vaccine plus blood,
trocknet, dann
where
die Kristalle, wobei diese
you see it dries out. When it dries out, the crystals form, and these rectangular ones are natrium chloride crystals, no problem. And
also so Mischkristalle würde man sagen. Ja,
they are mixed crystals as well, so quite impressive.
was ihr hier seht,
These things that we see here.
bivalenten Impfstoffe mit den Nanolipidpartikeln,
What we see here is the new bivalent
neuen
vaccines with the nanolipid particles.
Lipidpartikeln, die
The newer ones here, mRNAs,
Grundgröße,
contain these. The smaller ones
jetzt aber nicht mehr in
are the older ones. The newer ones are bigger for some reason, but I don't want to elaborate on that. They're clean. We don't find as much impurities, so they seem to have learned.
Frage der Selbstorganisation haben wir
To
hier
the
nämlich-
question
nämlich
of the self-organization, self-assembly,
sind also schon in einer
we've
gewissen
got
Phase der Austrocknung.
this video here. So we are in a phase of drying out, and then we see these balls forming.
So Nanolipidpartikel
That
zu tun.
has to do with the surface
Haben eine Oberflächenspannung gehabt.
characteristics of the nanolipids. They are electrically charged, they have a static surface charge, and we see strange phenomena as well, like this ball here. If you look at it, you see on the left side a dark area, which will go past. You can speed it up.
Ja, hier. Seht ihr den Wirbel hier daneben so dunkel?
Can you see this
Eine Amöbe, die sich da so
movement
ja,
like an amoeba here?
formiert. Aber solche Dinge können
However that may be,
Strukturen sich gebildet haben.
this is the vortex going past, so chemical processes gluing things together, and that starts and triggers currents on the object itself, and that may look like an organism. It is self-assembly, but you can't see any objective in that. And that's what you would have to prove. What does this little thing do? We couldn't do that because it kind of disappeared later on. So I just wanted to point out there is, of course, self-assembling structures, but in the micro world, they are a very, very frequently found phenomena.
Isn't there a possibility then that what you can find in nature anyway is being used here by those who manufacture the so-called vaccines in order to pursue their own purpose? For example, to be able to control from the outside, is that possible, or do you think that is pretty impossible?
Also zunächst erstmal kann man ganz allgemein sagen, das ist ja bekannt.
Well, to start with, generally speaking, I think we can talk about the radiographer's disease. That means the electromagnetic waves are able to do this.
That's an important image. That really looks like a circuit.
Ja, und da komme ich gleich drauf. So, also das elektromagnetische Wellen
So, electromagnetic waves can harm the body. That's general knowledge. The question is, how specifically can you do it? And is that really now the point, that you use these particles, having to put them in the body for that reason?
dass man also
Or for that aim, like having microwave waves, as we've mentioned before, that's quite simple. Let's take high-frequent radiation. You have the skin effect. It can't move deeply into the body, but if the radiation energy hits the surface and concentrates there, it creates burns in the skin. So this can be used as a weapon, no doubt.
Aber dazu brauchst du dann eben nicht
But you don't need to have any nanoparticles in the body or what?
der ist schon elektrisch genug. Das ganze
Well, the
Gehirn
body is electric enough. The whole brain works electrically. But in this question, I have to say, weapons systems, I'm no expert of that in any way.
was irgendwie
I don't want to talk about things being possible, what you can do whatever with. I don't know. But the things that you see here, that you say, that really looks like a printed circuit.
ja. Also was ich
What you see here, that's simple saline solution, no vaccine, and these crystals
wie ich das erläutert habe,
form, as I just said, and if I go under the slide now, I have exactly these structures. This is, you could say, this is a circuit.
aus wie die USS Enterprise.
The USS Enterprise.
psychologische Untersuchung.
I did a psychological test with that. I did a survey in the internet, on the internet, asking what is this? And 75% of the answers were, this is a printed circuit. But it isn't. It's simple saline solution, dried out in 2 dimensions, trying to crystallize.
Ja, also das heißt, man muss hier
So that means
zwar bei
we have to, in every, of course, skeptics that you have to have. That's why we look into the vaccines. You have to say that these natural phenomena that we have in the micro and in the macro world are so unknown to many that it's easy to interpret them wrongly, and then you have to look closely. So the functionality of any kind of body should have to be proven. There are nanobots. There's videos showing that they can go into cells and do things, and you see what they do. But if you can't prove that, it's pure speculation, and then basically you've lost the scientific grounds. Of course, you can do hypotheses. That's scientific, but then you have to take the next step.
Dass die Hypothese funktioniert.
herausfinden, wie kann ich jetzt
Yeah, find out what this does and what objectives it pursues.
Du hast ja ein bisschen militärischen Hintergrund.
Ja, genau.
Well, Holger, you have a military background, right?
Das sieht so aus, selbstverständlich. Es gibt zwar den sogenannten Skin
Well, as far as the arms topic is concerned, of course, there's a so-called skin effect, and the radiation doesn't go far into the body, but quite honestly, that is factually wrong. Because the people tend to forget that there are pulse waves, and currently we're working with frequency ranges.
Es ist ein Unterschied, ob ich eine harmonische Schwingung habe oder
The question is what happens. It's a different with I have a harmonic wave. Let's take a drill and a drill hammer. The drill hammer, a part of the pulse,
elektromagnetischen Wellen der Fall.
hits the body cells, and this is what we have in electromagnetic waves as well. To give you an example, that particles can make a big difference with respect to the effect of radiation. Just let me give you an example. The modern cancer therapy,
Genommen werden, in den Körper eingebracht
where
werden.
specific gold-plated nanoparticles are brought to the body, and due to their covering, they aggregate close to the tumor and then make sure that the X-ray radiation has a stronger reflection and a higher thermal effect at that place. And one reason is, for example, if you go into a MRI, why you shouldn't have any metallic parts in your body. If something interacts with a magnetic field, I can get it into movement. And that's Lenzsche rules. That's how every electric motor works. For example, if I bring small, sharp-pointed particles in the body that are ferocious, and they are in a body, and I move this body inside a circulating magnetic field, it makes a blender, because the magnetic particles would start to move inside the body. And so there's lots of means to do this. If we have these crystals, we would have to check whether there is this phenomena. But using an MRT, which we adapt, we've made MRIs to lie detectors, which could be an interesting point here, because your brain can't lie. It can tell you beforehand if you talk the truth or associate. I would like to put some politicians in that for a change. It's not clear, however. You can control thoughts with that. There was a trial once which was documented. A lady who had visions of God a long time, and she went from psychologist to psychologist and so on, until someone, a radiographer, came in and found out that her electric alarm clock next to her bed triggered a frequency which was exactly that, matching the dream phase, triggering that kind of phenomena. Even the press, there was official things where press representatives were invited to Japan to see what they can do, and they could do everything, the press guys. And one thing was prohibited, which was they couldn't walk down an aisle without getting out of balance. And this was already in the 2020s or in the 2019. We can see these things happen. Lots of things are well documented, so there is potential, yes. Whether it is actually done is open. However, we know manipulation in the brain is possible.
Well, it is suggested to us again and again that the other side is factually omnipotent. And if we take a closer look, then we find that there are actually indeed such possibilities, such experiments, but whether it actually really functions, we do not know so far.
We do know it works because the experiments have been done and they are published, whether it's done now or not.
So what you just described has been done, that people weren't able to walk straight anymore.
That was a manipulation with electric short waves of the brain. So it was about the simplest test was an effect on the inner ear with the body balance organ, which was disturbed. And the suggestion of thoughts, there's patents on this, has been done as well. It means that waves are sent out to, similar to what happened to that lady, and information is passed over, which only happens in their brain, but physically is not there. So the things experimentally have been done, because not only theoretically and experiments, whether it's currently being done, we don't know.
So can we assume that at least theoretically it is conceivable, even feasible, that, which is the topic all the time, that one can control people with things that have been injected them with the help of 5G?
Due to the array structures and the antenna structures, there's lots of experiments showing that it doesn't only affect the biosystem of the human being. With the blood, you can prove that quite clearly. Have you had a phone call in the last 15 minutes? You can use an EKG, EEG, dark field microscope with a blood sample. They can prove this. And if we use this, that we can do changes, we can change the pressure, the heartbeat, and so on, the heart of the people with the sign nodes. Yes, it is possible. Whether it is being done at a large scale, we don't know. It is possible, yes.
Well, my earlier argument that you don't necessarily need such trigger mechanisms was meant to say that in principle, because we function electromagnetically, electromagnetic waves can exert an influence, and that this can be triggered, that is something that is unquestionable.
The question is whether it's being done systematically at large scale.
We have experiments that were performed with 5G in certain areas, and we were able to observe those. And I also have in the basement a shelter, an electromagnetic shelter, which is shielded to up to 50 gigahertz, and I was able to perform comparative studies, and I was able to confirm these results. So the principle of humanism is, I think, therefore I am. With modern technologies, I cannot really assume that 100% anymore. But in order not to fall back into a dystopia anymore, you just painted this beautiful picture. It is where our own Starship Enterprise with our own energy field. And that means that the stronger our energy shield is on the surface, the more vital, the more better we are protected against this, because every field can counter the electromagnetic waves, and therefore it cannot penetrate as deeply. Funny example for our audience, we all knew the Duracell rabbit. So, to put it bluntly, just lick a 9-volt battery in order to reinforce your energy field, because the skin will have a higher energy then. And that takes me back to things we already had in the 1920s, electrotherapy, TENS therapy, and something like that. So that is what we can do to increase our defenses if we're not willing to do that via good nutrition and sports, etc.
We're an enterprise, spaceship, attacks, military. I'd like to ask you, I have seen Francis Boyle lately, a presentation. Professor Boyle is a well-known American legal expert specialized in bioweapons, and if I understand him rightly, he says, referring to COVID-19, we are dealing with a bioweapon here, although this is, and that's my layman's terms, a composed weapon, which is the virus as a kind of primer, but it can't do anything really to us as long as our immune system is working. It is a primer anyhow, and it is also the thing that's being used to panic the people that they agree to the so-called vaccination, which isn't a vaccination. So the actual lethal or harmful component is then the so-called vaccination later on. Did I get that right? How did you understand this?
Well, that's actually an excellent summary, but that's the modern art of war, to paint simple images again. I do not want to be persecuted, and I don't want to be found out. With a projectile, I know in out the left, in the right, then I know where the shot came from. And this weapon system is designed to cover up the source. So it will not express itself in a single disease. It will have different expressions. If somebody has a flu to start with, he can die of a flu. Or if you have a weakened immune system. So with a pathogen like this bioweapon of the 5th generation as SARS-CoV-2, what it is an introduction of a virus like that has an HIV component, so basically an AIDS virus. And if you have a strong immune system, it doesn't really bother you. But if you get a second injection, then this is reinforced and you get a cascading effect and the whole thing gets worse.
Vielleicht kann man auch mal etwas kriminologisch die Frage aufwerfen.
Maybe we could look at this from a criminalistic point of view. Let's hypothesize that there is something with a virus going on, and that is then tried to be identified with a PCR test with the respect in the concerned people. And so it did the nonsense that it did, and this is why we thought there was a pandemic. But as we want to help the people and protect them, we provide a vaccine, which is what we're using now. And then we find out an excess mortality in summer where corona plays no role, UV radiation, and people have enough vitamin D. In combination or in context with the vaccination in Germany, I say this because I looked into this, an explosion of excess mortality, which according to scientific terms is highly significant. And let's assume that the Paul-Ehrlich Institute got the budget turned down so that they didn't notice. And as someone who can analyze figures, you show this to the authorities, and after they don't react, you file a complaint, first in the district level, and then in the general level, and the Attorney General says nothing. And in the end, even the minister says nothing's going on. There is no witnesses listened to, the evidence is not looked at. It is just swept under the rug. And that gives us a contradiction between one side, we want to protect the people, but where apparently something is going on, and it's not only correlation, but if we look at the pathology conference, for example, we can prove a causality where the reports in the health insurances explode, these life insurances get a problem, nothing happens, question mark?
Well, that is what we saw from the very beginning of the so-called vaccinations. In a nursing home in Berlin, somebody filmed secretly with a camera to show what happened when the vaccinations were first administered, and then in interviews with the personnel involved, we found that, I think within 14 days, out of 31 vaccinated, quotation marks, patients, one of them was particularly fit, he was still jogging, I think he was also a piano player. 8 died, and in 11 other cases there were serious health problems. At the time, we weren't yet at the point that pathologists tried afterwards to look in the context of a post-mortem at what this could have been based on, what the reason might have been. And as you said, Klaus, the system has failed, as we believed at the beginning. By now we know that the system did not fail, but the system has been shaped by the other side, which is responsible for this pandemic, and primed in such a way that the judiciary was not even allowed to investigate. But what I take from this, from what you just said, both of you, is that it is actually true, or that you do believe, both of you, that it is actually a composite bioweapon, and that it is not or has never been about health, but that the population was, of course, made to believe, with the help of the exaggeration of the danger of the virus, through the PCR test, they were made to believe that the only salvation was the vaccine, and that was the PCR test.
Wenn es die Gesundheit gegangen wäre, Reiner,
if it had been about health, Reiner, they could have simply do what they do in normal ABC defense, use chlorine dioxide, paragraph 11 of the German Drinking Water Act, disinfecting all the drinking water. And lots of the sicknesses that we have by the disinfection with ester, ether, alcohol going into the blood, we could have minimized lots of diseases by that. If it had been about healthy, it would have been looked how many people are there, how many are healthy, how many are sick before and after. And that gives us a confirmation again. Yes, it's a multi-level system. And what I wanted to say, it's not only about the mechanically harmful substances. That was easiest to prove, and I told Arne that, who looked for it in pathology. But it is a multi-level system. Simply such is the vaccination is multi-level. The cationic lipid has a durability of about 77 years.
In the old vaccines.
Yes, in the old vaccines, we have to say, to be fair, the new ones are twice as harmful because we've got twice mRNA that can enter the body cells at the same time. And we talked about how do viruses and bacteria make sex? Well, because communication in the communication. So there is cross results possible that are beyond description. And I get reports back from doctors who had about 2,500 cancer inspections, examinations per week. These doctors have surged to 12,000 now, and we know that the cationic lipid can trigger cancer. We don't only have the vessel damages, we have so many cancers and so many different types of diseases. I've seen it with my father, where the pre-damage is there. That's the biggest point. And then you can say in advance, he was sick before. My father has the example, he fell on his bottom Christmas, had a big bruise there, and he got vaccinated. And 3 months later, he got that same bruise back. And with the means that we had available at the time, we could reverse it. So that means the cell elasticity of the cycle, our arginine and other substances play a role here. And I would like to point out this here, that sparking fear-mongering doesn't count. I have a little story. The only allergy I have is allergy against fear. And my father, when I saw the ghost under my bed to my father, after the third time, he gave me a torchlight so that I could look it for myself and be courageous. And that is what I would like to pay people. There are things possible. Look at it, be courageous. You can help, even if it is evil what we have here.
And maybe in this sense, one piece of information might be important for those who might notice changes in themselves and believe that they're told, of course, no, it can't possibly be caused by the vaccination. But we now, we haven't published it yet, but it will be published soon. We performed correlation studies, i.e. the curves for the number of weekly vaccinations administered across all Europe and the deaths that show maxima, that if you offset them in time, they become almost a perfect match. You get maximum correlation between these two curves, and now you need to be well seated 20 weeks after. That's 7 months. In other words, 7 months after the vaccination, most of the deaths occur. Nobody still thinks that this might have been caused by the vaccination. And the deaths have multiple causes, as Holger already said, because all sorts of disease patterns are triggered depending on what form of organ is damaged, what kind of cancers are caused.
Dementia, heart attack, the whole range, actually. We have, I think, over 1,500 possible adverse effects that we found, and Pfizer themselves, if you look at the background documentation, published a similar list.
Well, all three of us are no physicians, but we do have physicians who have spoken out, a lot of them. and also nursing staff. Possibly the best findings might come from the American Army, where lawyer colleague Tom Renz from Ohio, in the context of a Senate hearing, I think it was Ron Johnson, the senator was listening to that. He spoke with 3 military physicians, with 3 whistleblowers, and what he learned from them was that diseases that until then had hardly or never occurred at all suddenly exploded. Breast cancer in women by hundreds, I think over 1,000%, myocarditis hundreds of percent. So a whole series of diseases that until then had not been observed often or not observed at all, suddenly exploded. And the important thing is that it only was observed after the vaccination started. And it's also particularly significant because the group of people affected was not old people who had some kind of previous condition, but rather young, fit, and in some cases specially trained people between 18 and 35, I think. And if this reflects reality, and I don't doubt it, then we really have to watch out quite clearly and make sure that these data, that these findings come to light. We don't need to slide unnecessarily into areas where we're not quite sure, so we assume that something might happen with graphene oxide, and together with 5G it can turn us into zombies or whatever, but we have to deal with what is more likely. The so-called vaccines are what is the biggest problem for us. So we're no physicians, but it makes a lot of sense to me, and I got it from a doctor, namely Jody Markovitz. It makes a lot of sense to me to hear that if your immune system is fit, then you can normally handle anything that's out there. But as soon as your immune system is damaged, for instance by the so-called vaccinations, you're in danger.
That's what I wanted to point out, if we do have the time. This examination that I've just talked about, the statistic correlation with the 29 weeks, if you take that time lag, then you can also take the data and look at how does the number of deaths rise in correlation of the number of doses. And we do see a correlation, a linear function. That's really the thing. They tell us, politics tells us that, of course, adverse effects are very, very rare. That means less than 1 to 50,000. Rare means 1 per 2,000. And this linear correlation shows an increase from which you can deduce a number. It's more cases than 1 per 2,000. The calculation basis is 1 death per 1,745 cases, and of course deaths are only the peak of the iceberg, the worst adverse effect, so nothing is rare, by no means.
Or let's take the other example that I find so dramatic regarding abortions. Children lost abortions. We had cases where the mothers who got a vaccination lost the fetus, or the fetus had to be removed in the 6th month because no kidneys had formed. So we don't know what kind of genetic prepositions are out there, because we've spoken about it earlier, that we know that there is proof that the DNA actually interferes with human DNA, that the vaccine does that. And then there are phenomena which we can justify quite scientifically, called shedding. And we also suspected initially that it only happens from human to human with sexual intercourse, but it actually goes from humans to animals. And I have investigated that myself. I've followed up on this myself. So stop trying to lie to us. stop inoculating our children. That's dangerous. And if we see the damage caused to the reproductive organs, what's going to happen to the children when they grow up? Are they capable of reproducing at all?
We don't know all of that, but we do know that there are severe damages in vaccinated women, that there is a strong increase of aborts, and at the same time a strong decrease of births. And I've learned this on a conference about 3 weeks ago in Portugal, and it was explained to me by a number of very, very interesting presentation on the birth drops in Germany, around 18%. It could increase further. Another example was Basel City, a drop of 43% after the vaccinations. That's massive. So if that is part of the plan, apparently, and we hear that again and again, is about population control with 2 subpoints, reduction on one side and full control over the remaining people. This reduction aspect has become visible by now. I can't think and imagine that this is coincidental if all of this only happens after the probably most dangerous part of the bioweapon, the injection.
Maybe I can make a comment on the decline in birth rates. That's something we have to take a closer look at because there are different components that might have an impact here. I'm speaking here of my own life experience. I come from the GDR, from former East Germany. When the wall came down, the Deutschmark was introduced, and the moment that happened, our foreign trade, because East Germany was the biggest exporter within the Eastern Bloc, but the others didn't have the Deutschmark, so the market collapsed from one day to the next. Companies crashed overnight, and people all knew, oh, tomorrow I probably don't have a job anymore. That led to a decline in birth rates that happened here in the east of Germany that was stronger than the effect of the Second World War. So that means we're also controlled by fear now. We have several components: fear of the future, crises, war, etc., and the vaccination. So in order to do justice to the question, I just want to point out that it is more difficult with the birth rate. We can't simply attribute it one-to-one to the vaccination.
Absolutely. On top of that, we have energy crisis, deindustrialization, so that fear porn that they put in our heads all the time. Fear is the key to control, but it's quite significant here in the abortions. So the women who want to become pregnant, and if you have sisters and brothers or your father, you know how engaged you are in this, and then it fails, and this failure rate, I think, has increased by 700% or so. But from a phenomena which happened occasionally, we hear it very often now, compared to before, where we never heard about this. There was little talk about this before, that this is also a part of the correlation, so that in some, we definitely have a massive decrease, rather, here in Europe and the so-called Western civilization, supported by these political systems.
Do we then have to think about it at the end of the day? Of course, there are other factors as well, but it is quite obvious that after the beginning of the so-called vaccinations, considerable damage manifested itself left, right, and center. So do we have to think about what can be found in these vaccines, in the vials, even if we can't really comprehend right now what it is? So is the only thing that we can scientifically prove now that these are at least impurities, or can you say more about that, what it is?
Well, the impurities are a side effect that can be used still. However, the main problem, and that's something that you shouldn't lose track of, you have to look in all directions here, is the functional mechanism of the modified mRNA vaccines itself. That here, it is not only the decisive point that it's based on corona, because this technology with the toxic nanolipid particles is to be generalized. Other vaccinations are going to be used on that basis. And let me only remind you, this is something that I didn't think of, it's our work group, that on the basis of the knowledge, biology, so that's normal school knowledge, high school, that we know that we have an immune system which reacts to body cells that do something they shouldn't do, and they are attacked. And because each injection goes into the blood, definitely it has to, it means that all kind of mRNA technology will, first of all, kill the vessels and other organs. And we did see that in our examinations, that wherever the envelopes of the lipid nanoparticles that hold the mRNA to get it into the cells, where these were high quality in the production, so the mRNA wasn't released before or lost or damaged. So those who made it into the cell due to their characteristics to do the function that they should in the cell, that they had most side effects. So the main problem is the principle that's going to be generally applied. With that, you destroy, if you do that, the sense of all vaccinations, because you'll always trigger these functional failures at the same time.
Well, to second that, there are different stages in the vaccines that are partially based on the materials, partially on the spike protein that damage fertility. And we can say that this was unknown because in our study we tried to find out what Pfizer did know, and this has been known since the 19th, some of it, that this can lead to a problem with the ovum nesting. If we take the psychological, sociological aspect now, it still can't distract from the fact that we brought many people in principle into fertility disturbances, which are conditioned by the preparation and the composition of the preparation.
The blood-brain barrier is crossed always as well.
Yeah, blood-brain damage, dementia, it's always crossed and it has impacts. And we did get confirmation by pathologists by now that this burns holes in the brain. And there was a doctor who had the preposition and he didn't have the immune strength, had holes in his brain as well. But they say people grew old and they don't have a healthy immune system. But I spoke to a doctor who says he never had a case of ovarian cancer with a 10-year-old before.
Say that again, with the holes in the brain. Is that figuratively or literally?
So if you take the right images, you can actually see those holes. The pathologists can do that with slices. As I say, my favorite lie detector, if you use this technology, you can see how the degenerative process, just like with dementia, through the incorrect protein deposits, can burn holes in the brain. And with this doctor, who got vaccinated, got infected with this. The blood-brain barrier is no problem for this system.
That's a special aspect of this, as Professor Bhakti and his wife, Professor Reiner Reiss, told us about the vaccines, that they can pass the blood-brain barrier and then these toxic nanoparticles get delivered to the brain. I heard an interview about this. I did an interview with Dr. Peter Breckjung and Dr. Naomi Wolf some time ago. Dr. Naomi Wolf explained what that looks like in reality, the effect of what Professor Bhakti tells a change in personality. She said that she was at a party in Manhattan, and apparently it was mainly vaccinated people, and she said it all looked okay from the outside, but something was missing. It was kind of unvivid, unlively. And Professor Bregan, due to the new findings of Professor Bhakti, he talked about personality changes, and what he thinks of when he hears that. He's the one who banned lobotomy in the US, or helped in banning it, one of the worst crimes against humanity that was ever been done. I say most people don't know what it is. It's the damage of the brain, alive, of the frontal lobes are destroyed. If you've seen the film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, you have a rough idea of what that is. And together with that, and that matches what you say, Holger, that is comparable to that. Holes in the brain. It's logic that leads to changed personalities.
There's always a change of personality. Buzzword dementia. What is classical in dementia? People either grow shy or aggressive. That is always a sign of changes in your brain, because you have this loss and you still have a shadow of a memory, and you notice this loss, and that makes you either fearful, and fear is ultimately one stage of fear is aggression. So generally speaking, by all of these processes, we're reduced to our brain stem. So the reptile brain, attack, flight or fight. And we see that with people, they're intimidated and they think, no, I can't do anything. Yes, you can do something. And if you don't do anything, that is, you also do something that's probably the worst thing you can do. Aggression is something that we encounter a lot. Leave me alone with these vaccinations.
Yes, but that's the biggest question. None of us are medical doctors. We're not psychologists either. We need more. As we've talked to Dr. Peter Bregan, we have to talk to more psychologists, because if we only see the effects, we can't do any medical diagnosis. We need the experts for that. Or do you have any closer findings?
That is the reason why I advise the physicians for clearing up. And we also have psychologists and physicians on the expert advice group on vaccination. And what frequently happens is that our advice is asked for, and they find the right terminology. So I always say, I see the consequences. They can look into the details, but we can see the consequences. We can explain how things may be linked. And that is how we could develop a number of different ways of protection or healing. And you don't leave people in the lurch. You try things out, you check against medicine, and that's why I'm saying what I'm saying. If you have a deficit and this attack puts you in a deficient state, and then you need to do something about it. Sometimes solid nutrition, sports is no longer enough. Just like as if you'd been hit by a bullet, you have a strong injury already. And so I also had this thought, and some people might think I'm naive. Why is IMF, why do they eat meat but love vegans? Well, because in order to heal this vascular damage, you need a lot of protein. And nobody has been able to explain to me how with a vegan lifestyle, the body can get enough protein in order to heal itself, then you at least need to have food additives, or you have to be an omnivore, like we were created. And in the past, something that helps was called winter in the past. It's fasting today. And you see that with a sick child. If a child is sick, it doesn't want to eat. After 36 hours, the body changes, the metabolism changes, you go to a keto phase. And this means that the pathogen cannot easily penetrate into the cell anymore. Understand and copy nature, Victor Schauberger. And these are the things that we have to tell people, because we're not defenseless. Only if we close our eyes, then we'll hit the next wall.
I think that's a crucial point, and possibly a good closing word if we haven't left anything out which is of major concern. I think we all three agree, and if I interpret your work properly, Holger, the doctors agree to that. I think Dr. Judy Michowitz, whom I'm very fond of, holds up this fact again and again. If our immune system functions and we don't allow it to be damaged by having the right diet and exercising, we may not need to be completely careless, but we don't need to worry and be concerned of these viruses, even if they were created in a virus, bring us to our knees. Is that true?
Yes. And the most important function with all of this is inhaling and exhaling. People have oxidative stress and completely misunderstood it. And if you want to understand what I'm saying, hold your breath for 3 minutes and repeat the question. That is what the attack is geared to. Oxygen deprivation, masks, etc. And with oxygen therapy can do a lot about people becoming more sensible again.
Are there any possibilities? I'm not asking you as the experts and non-doctors. In the context of your work, you, Holger, as the consultant, and Klaus, you as well as a consultant, have you heard of possibilities on how to reverse what damage that was done by the vaccines, or are there things like changes of the DNA that you can't reverse anymore?
Well, both yes and no. With the DNA, I'm not quite sure yet. We have developed substances with which we can damage the vessels, because the elasticity of the cardiovascular system, that's the nitrogen cycle. How to counteract that? For example, protein adenine in a certain cocktail plays a big role here. We found that the inflammatory processes, that they can be very well offset, and chlorine dioxide plays an important role here, oxygen therapy also, but chlorine dioxide plays an important role. Andreas and myself work with Conneval, Andreas with Colassa. If people just learn to give themselves an enema, you can achieve a lot. It's an unpleasant topic. But how do I apply a drug to a child the fastest way if I don't want to inject it? Well, it was the good old suppository. We can also do similar things with his oxidative factors, because then you can get rid of the toxins at the same time that you compensate for them. We have all these home remedies that work so well, such as Sister's tea or a horsetail tea, to generate silicone in the body that will bind pollutants. So we can have a show in its own right about this. I have been able to help, I think, more than 1,000 people who came along with vaccination side effects. Help for self-help. As an engineer, I have no idea about people, about man, but to look at humans as God's machine and to ensure that there are the right operating materials available will make this machine last longer.
Sounds positive.
I would also second the idea that we have a special edition here, a special meeting for this. There is a special work group with treatment. Treatment might not be legally correct, but in cooperation with physicians, protocols are developed here to show what helps with which complaints resulting from these corona vaccinations. And that is something that we could speak about here at the appropriate time.
80% of the things can be resolved by the people themselves if they just got a little information.
We'll certainly follow up on that. We will also speak with natural healers whose abilities, as far as I've determined in the meantime, have been intentionally pushed back and whose possibilities were framed as conspiracy theorists in favor of the predominantly deadly pharmaceutical industry, as we found so far. We will concern ourselves with these people as well. I have another question to you, Klaus, as a physicist. We have heard again and again, and I believe also from Andreas Kalka, that after the vaccination, the so-called vaccination, those who were administered these shots emit signals that can be received via Bluetooth and cell phones, but I've also heard contrary statements about this in the sense that nobody's been able to prove this. I think it was Andreas Kalka that, well, you can walk across a cemetery and then you can pick up these signals. Is that true or is that sheer nonsense?
First of all, I would like to stay out of this topic because I didn't try it out myself. The only thing I can say from my technical understanding, to give you an example, it can be radiation sources which are unspecific and they hit a sensor which is to select. Let's assume voice control. You can try that in your computer. You make some kind of noise and suddenly the computer with its not smart shows you a word. These are the phenomena that I could imagine that you could kind of see that due to some electromagnetic circumstances which you can't see. That's something that you'd have to investigate in. So I would have to have someone who's vaccinated and I try it and I could say something about it. I could imagine that this kind of phenomena exists, but I don't know it, and that's just why I'd rather not say about it.
Well, we performed examinations in this context. I mentioned the MP shelter earlier, but I would only call it a phenomenology. A phenomenon that occurred was that someone in a secured room had a MAC address, went out of the room, but this MAC address was unspecific, and after 15 minutes we performed another measurement with triangulation with several measuring devices. We had a new MAC address. A MAC address is actually characterized by the fact that it is specifically to a unique device. As a phenomenon, yes. As a statement, I really don't see enough falsification in large quantities.
Okay, I thought that. Well, if we have covered our topic range to sufficient extent, I would say at least we found a positive conclusion. Say we can protect ourselves. There is a high danger. We can protect ourselves, however, and even after the damage by the so-called vaccines, we can get help.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, great. So I thank you too. Thank you, Klaus. Thank you, Holger. We are surely going to meet up again, maybe in a bigger group.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for the invite.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having us. Bye-bye.
Well, this session of the International Crimes Investigative Committee looked at 4 different topics. We tried to determine scientifically a phenomenon that has been reported again and again, namely, are there self-assembling structures in these vaccines? But we did find that's possible, but it could also be that this is a perfectly natural phenomenon, crystalline structures that also were shown to us by one of the scientists, Klaus Retzlaff, as harmless, but everything is possible. We also tried to find out now what is the bioweapon, the virus, the so-called virus, which has been laboratory made, which is a nearly uniform opinion, and then cooperates with another element. So it's a composite bioweapon. So first you have the virus to generate fear, which was blown out of proportion with completely pointless PCR tests. But it is a primer that with people with preconditions can suffer from, and the real bioweapon that is either lethal or can cause serious harm is the actual injection. Is there interaction between what is injected and external sources, 5G, for example? We don't know. It's possible, but we know if this is the case, that 5G and microwaves altogether are dangerous, or something that we've discussed in previous sessions, and we'll have to take a look at it in detail again. We hope that we can get an expert called Barry Tower in this context. But what is comforting is that if you protect your immune system by eating well, by exercising, that with an intact immune system, you're protected against nearly everything, including artificially made viruses. And for those who took the risk because they were ignorant or because they thought I can hack this, and who allowed themselves to be injected with these highly dangerous vaccines, there's ways and means to help them too. Thank you very much.